I'm the moderator for this panel. I'm an honorary research fellow, associate fellow at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia, at the Asia Research Institute, and I'm here with the director of the institute, Associate Professor Gek Coup, who is actually doing all the administrative process. And we're here today to talk about the serious issue of what's happening in Myanmar after the coup 1 week ago by the Tatmadaw, led by General Min Aung. And what has happened in the course of the week, which we've seen attempts to assert power by the military, a civil disobedience movement, a intensive mobilization of people on the streets, including yesterday and today, and of course worrying issues associated with crackdown that are in terms of rabble rousing along those lines, in terms of media reports this evening. It is a very serious issue, most serious, of course, for the Myanmar people, who have now facing the prospect of a return to military rule, but it's also a serious issue for the international community and for the world. And so today I'm really honored and pleased to have brought together with help and 4 speakers to talk about what is happening and what is the impact moving forward. Just a little bit about the background. When we put this panel together, we were not sure whether or not we would be able to get speakers from the country, given the issues of internet crackdown and also the concerns of maintaining the safety for our speakers. So all of the speakers have strong ties to Myanmar, having worked in Myanmar for many, many years, and in Myanmar lived in, and of course, one of our speakers is Burmese, but it is also intentionally so to where we've organized it in this particular way. We have a lot to talk about, and I think it's best that we just begin. I'm going to keep my introductions brief because we want to have a conversation. We can all see each other, but I have some sort of technical administrative announcements that I have to make, which I think are important to recognize. We will be recording this session through until the discussion session. So the speakers will be recorded, but the discussion will no longer be recorded to allow for an open discussion and protection of people making their remarks. This software, Teams, has its challenges, as all do. And so in these circumstances, we really need people who aren't speaking to keep their mics off. There isn't a sort of master control in terms of that process, so we need you to be conscious of that in moving forward in this particular way. We also will let you know that this will be not only is recorded, but it will be available for people to look at on UoNARI-M's website. University of Nottingham's Asia Research Institute has been active for many, many years, and it's really, we know that this is a very important issue, and we're very delighted to have this opportunity to speak on these issues. Our first speaker is someone who I have tremendous respect for and have known for many years, Thinley Wynn. She is a specialist on issues of food security, climate change, and issues associated with food production, but also a specialist on Myanmar politics. She is working based in Rome, but have helped to set up Kite Tails and also a number of research outfits during the transition in Myanmar during critical years when the military was giving up political power, or at least trying to act like it was giving up political power. I turn it over to Tin to speak first. Thank you, Tin.
Thanks, Bridget. Can you hear me? Great. Yeah, good morning from Europe, and thanks for having me. I was struggling how to start this with beyond just how awful it all is. But I guess if you'll indulge me, I'd like to go back 5 years ago or 6 years ago and start with a personal reflection on to February the 1st, 2016, 5 years ago, when I was in Naypyidaw to cover the opening of the new democratically elected parliament. And the excitement was palpable. There was penny everywhere. Penny is this orange cotton clothing that has become synonymous with NLD members in the last few decades. Just a few months before that, in November 2015, I had voted for the first time in my life. I was too young to vote in the 1990 elections, and I was out of the country in 2010. I was also trying to keep a low profile because I hadn't told the Burmese embassy in the country that I was living in at that time that I was a journalist. And we all know what happened to Burmese journalists if they cross the junta. So in November 2015, cast my vote in person in my home constituency in Yangon. I had misgivings about that election. Particularly the fact that it became virulently nationalistic as the polls, drew near. And of course, there were problems with the 2008 constitution. But on that day, on February 1st, 2016, and 5 years ago, it was difficult not to be swept up in that whole emotion and the excitement and optimism, even though I was a journalist and supposed to be, objective and neutral, because I was witnessing an historic event that I didn't think I was going to see in my lifetime. Of course, that 5 years since, we have seen a lot of failures from the NLD government, many of which has been very well documented by some of the speakers on the panel that I have with me today. The most egregious, perhaps, is their failure to speak out on the mistreatment of the Rohingya, but they also didn't speak out, when it comes to harassment and defamation suits that were filed against human rights activists and journalists, including, my ex-colleagues from both Myanmar Now and Reuters news agencies, and of course the mass disenfranchisement of ethnic voters in the 2020 elections. But you know what? A coup is not the answer. And I know it sounds obvious to be saying this, but I feel like I have to make this point because since a week ago, I have seen these hot takes on the media, both on social media as well as on mainstream media about, oh yeah, coups are bad, but Suu Kyi was awful. But no, this is not just about Daw Suu or the NLD. Myanmar has 54 million people, 54 million people who are struggling to survive amid a pandemic and an economic crisis. So the World Bank released a statement last December that sort of estimated that poverty levels are going to rise from 22% to 27% 2020, 2021 because of COVID. Lots of economic sectors have been affected by the lockdowns, and Romain, I'm sure, has many more insights than I do. But in a poor country like Myanmar, what do many people do when incomes are tight? They cut back on things like what they eat. But even before the pandemic, we had like 14% of people who were going to bed hungry and 61% who cannot afford healthy diets. Now, there was a research by a think tank in November that also found that a third of the households that they surveyed said they didn't have any income at all for the whole month of September. These are aggregate numbers, yeah? Imagine what it is going to be like in ethnic areas which are poorer in so many ways and in conflict zones. We still have almost a third of a million people who are displaced because of fighting, and nearly 1 million Rohingya across the border in Bangladesh. I realize it might be hard for the international community to sort of decouple Myanmar's political future from Daw Suu, but I cannot stress this enough because you need to see this coup beyond a single person. And I say this because I was a child when the 1988 protests happened. I lost years of schooling in high school and in university. I was very lucky. I was born in a privileged family, so I was able to go abroad and study. So many others couldn't.
Because it's not on Chromes, on Teams. It's the most.
And I saw, what that did to a whole generation of bright people. Now the army is going to do the same thing to a new generation. There's going to be another massive brain drain. Despite all the depressing scenarios that I've just mentioned, I just want to end it with perhaps sort of a hopeful note, because there is one big hope, and that's the younger generation that are in Myanmar today. We've seen how angry they are from the protest that's happened. They've tasted freedom, at least some form of it, for the past 10 years. And they said they're not going to take this coup lying down. They're very savvy with technology and social media, and they know how to reach out to people half the world away. Just, think of the Hunger Game 3-finger salute that they've started using, all the memes now on social media. They're super creative. The amount of art that has come out that, again, you know, can reach out to so many people who might not even have heard of Burma or Myanmar. But the best thing is that they aren't tied to these old sort of alliances strictly along the lines of race and religion and ethnicity. I mean, I don't know if you've seen it, but there were a picture of these two young women that were leading a protest on Saturday wearing these Cayenne outfits. A little bit over a year ago, one of those young women was out in Yangon handing out T-shirts with a message saying, "I stand against genocide in Myanmar." So there, you know, of course, you'll see that many of the protesters are calling for the release of Do Su and the NLD lawmakers, but there are also a lot of people who are calling for more deeper, more fundamental changes. And I think they're bringing in such much needed fresh voices and perspectives. And I hope that continues. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, so much, then, for these important issues about decoupling, about your own personal narrative in this discussion, and also the critical issues associated with the new voices that are emerging. It's a great start for the panel. I'd like to turn next to Debbie Stoddard. She is with Alt ASEAN Burma, which has actually been a very important organization in discussing human rights issues in Burma, Myanmar for over a number of decades. She has extensive on-the-ground networks of which she's worked with over the years, and is an open spokesman on issues involving human rights in Myanmar. Debbie?
Thank you, Bridget, and thank you, Tin Nguyen, for really opening the session so amazingly well. I'm tasked to talk about human rights and the impacts of this coup, but just before the coup happened, Burma, Myanmar was already in a dire situation. We tracked the number of military attacks targeting or causing direct harm to civilians from between 2011 and 2020. These attacks rose from 424 attacks to 1,024 attacks. So we saw a 142% rise in military attacks on civilians, mostly ethnic minorities in the border areas. And we also saw the budget for the military rise by 180% during the same period. So and what was even more disconcerting and concerning was that during the pandemic, while COVID started to hit Myanmar in a very invisible way, the military actually stepped up attacks and barred humanitarian access, not just in Rakhine and southern Chin state, but also in northern Shan states. And more recently, they stepped up attacks on civilians in Karen state, where there's supposed to be a peace agreement in place. So clearly, we have this huge problem. And on top of that, migrant workers from Burma were forced to return from China and neighboring countries, but more particularly Thailand. So many families who depended on remittances from migrants now had no money. And that's why we saw somehow so many households, as Tin Nguyen mentioned, not having income at all in the month of September. But we also had families who had an extra person to feed. So we have to also recognize that some of those young people out there were migrant workers who were very often the sole income earners for their families. And they are really fighting for their future. So I totally agree that while it's the whole focus on free Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD leaders is very prominent in the photographs and the messages and the chanting, this is bigger than Do Su. This is bigger than the NLD. And when we think about that, at the people who have traditionally been most vulnerable would be women, would be ethnic nationalities, and would be young people. who are consistently targeted and harassed by the armed forces and by other people in authority, including at checkpoints and other places. So we do need to consider, when this is happening now, what could happen, whether or not the coup is successful and overturned, or whether there is a crackdown. And this is exciting because this morning they launched a national strike. It's a national day of action. On Thursday, there will be a global day of solidarity for trade unions with Myanmar on Thursday, 11th of February. So this is a very momentous week. But let's look at what is happening. People are who actually have health problems will not be able to get access to assistance because of the increased militarization on the streets, because of the disruption. We are really, really concerned about what that might, what that implies in terms of the fact that COVID is still on the rise in the country. We're concerned about the fact that we are seeing increased militarization in urban centers, and I mean, I'm old enough. I was an adult when 888 happened, so we're having flashbacks to that. And it's very significant because I'm not having a flashback to the Saffron Revolution, which was also very very horrible. The backlash was very horrible, but I'm actually I'm having a flashback to 888 and what happened to the young people of my generation. We do need to be very, very concerned about the fact that the military is also strengthening its divide and rule strategy to get to try and enlist ethnic minority leaders to participate in this junta and to give it some legitimacy, but also the intense, what appears to be intense and even very, very life-threatening threats against, pressure against election workers to admit that this was a fraudulent election, to somehow give, basically, it's, if you imagine Donald Trump as a Burmese general with an army at his disposal, this is what's happening. And they've taken, it looks like Min Aung Hlaing has taken a page out of Trump's playbook and actually intensified it because he has an army at his disposal. So we are going to see, even if this coup is overturned, we're going to see a huge fallout on human rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights of the population. But on the plus point, I mean, you just can't help but be swept away and both inspired and a little bit concerned for the safety of all these protesters, including people who are alumni of our various training programs out there. You know, we said, this is what we train them for. We hope that they will take into account the risk assessments that we encourage them to practice. But, you know, this is out of our hands now. All we can do is back them up from the outside and mobilize international opinion and get governments to act and get intergovernmental organizations to act. And that means ensuring that the military does not financially and economically profit from this coup, because we cannot underestimate the economic motive in this picture. Finally, what was really great and what gave me hope was more and more activists in Burma and more people on the street are starting to acknowledge that they do have to have more solidarity with the Rohingya people, and they do need to recognize that what happened to the Rohingya is genocide. One of the things that really touched me was someone on Twitter actually apologizing to Young Healy for being harsh to her in the past over the question of the Rohingya, and postings on Facebook saying the Rohingya are standing with us even when we didn't stand with them, and when this is over, we know we have to return the solidarity. So that's the thing that is very moving. that it's shifted some perspectives on the ground, and that if we can come out of the other end of this coup, it'll be something that will perhaps promote human rights more positively in the country. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Debbie, for both raising the concerns and also talking about the real transformative optimism that we also are seeing emerging. All right, we now have our third speaker, who is Gayatri. Yeah, I always mispronounce her last name, which I shouldn't do, but I'm going to try for it. Venkaiteshwaran, which she is an assistant professor at the University of Nottingham. She's a specialist on media and media issues and freedom. She's written and published a book on media issues in Myanmar. She has been part of the freedom issues of journalism, protection of journalists, and we're really honored that she could speak with us today. I'll turn it over to you, Gayatri.
Thanks, Bridget, and thank you so much. And it's really good to see the other panel members from afar as well. As Debbie said, for her it's a deja vu for 1988, and for even for myself also, I think it's been a sort of a red flag at are we going back to those years? But I think at least in one way, significant changes have happened over the years, and we cannot deny, especially in the context of media. And I think that that's one of the areas in which we have always seen that it becomes the canary in the coal mine, right? There've been that kind of reminders, and also the sort of warning signals about at least seeing some of the trends. When the opening was first announced, and initial discussions were made, media reforms was put out there as one of the major areas of reform by the quasi-civilian government way back in 2011, 2012, which signified that they knew this was one of the things that the international community and also the democratic forces would look at. How free is the media? So it allowed for at least the opening to happen. And I think that what we see today, reporters on the ground are reporting as we speak. They are, despite the threats of the network shutdown, despite also actually facing the military crackdown, they continue to be on the ground to report what is happening. And that's precisely why the shutdown was also announced, to keep international scrutiny away from what is happening. So just to say that I think as we think about how in the past events of 1988, 1990, 2007, we have definitely seen at least some changes that also empower different institutions, different groups. And so what we see today also stems from people being able to exercise some of their rights and demand for those rights. And I will talk about the media in the sense that while many in the media were already starting to open up, there was always concern that a return to this sort of a military control could always happen. It was something that always played in the back of their minds, but that did not hamper them from really expanding the work that they were doing. This included media that had operated in exile, that returned, some actually deciding to keep one foot in and then one foot out as well, to make sure that they have somewhat of a safe exit plan. But they used whatever opportunities that were available since 2011, 2012 to build up their own media outlets, to have access to training, to expand the kind of issues that they were able to report, given the censorship before this. And so what we see is increased, at least attempts to have investigative journalism. Tin earlier said about outlets like Myanmar Now really pushing in for investigative journalism, and also bringing in a lot of public talks or talk shows. And this has created that sort of expectations of the public as well, that this is what a much more open society would look like, that we're able to discuss this, we're able to hold people to account, even though we still don't have that ability to, to demand for that kind of justice, accountability in all cases. But to have these conversations take place in the last few years is very, very important. And I think that some of the calls that we see today in these protests also come from this, the opportunities of being exposed to these issues. And I think that has really come from the media taking on its role as best as it can. I mean, we can definitely talk about some of the challenges that the media have faced, media taking positions, being biased, again, within the context of the coverage of the genocide. It certainly showed the divisiveness within society. But I think, all in all, we can say that with limited resources, it is very difficult to operate media. We all know that they have been suffering financially as well. But given the limited resources, they have taken that role very seriously, because this is an experience that was marred by that kind of self-censorship, being thrown into prison for writing the truth, for questioning. And so this is something that's really, at the crux of this democratic movement, or at least by the democratic forces. And I think we do need to keep that also in the foreground, because it is not the same society. I think that's one of the things we recognize, that the force of the military continues to grow, had continued to grow because of the international support and legitimacy it got. And I think that, I think that is a huge problem. But society has changed over time as well, and have different sets of expectations. And that's why I think the earlier speakers who talk about this movement not necessarily tied to or pegged to Dorsu personally, but I think that to me, it's because that there's a sense of shared value that goes beyond the icon. And I think that's really quite important. But earlier when I mentioned about the, some of the skepticism, or at least the kind of pessimism some in the media had held over the last few years, was because they did experience the continued threats from the military. So it wasn't that, with 2012 quasi-civilian government, with 2016 NLD government, that the pressure from the military automatically reduced. It didn't. Those covering particularly the ethnic states continued to confront with the military. And at the same time also being at risk because of the ethnic armed groups and other interest groups as well. But also if you were covering issues related to the military, or where the military had a vested interest, they were at risk already. So from the Voice Daily, from Reuters, Irrawaddy, many of these journalists have been investigated, charged under a variety of laws that are still there. So one of the, I suppose, the major weaknesses with the NLD government in the last 5 years was not to dismantle some of these problematic laws, which gave currency to the military to continue to assert its powers. But what I wanted to say was that a lot in the media had already shared that the risks that they face from the military had not necessarily abated over the years. If anything, it had increased, whereby the military had used then the laws in order to target journalists. And so this is a complex situation in which to say that we are surprised by what has happened, maybe not, but maybe the extent to which it had taken place did catch many people by surprise. But I think there were warning signs, and I think those in the media who were confronting institutions like this had put out those signals already to just be careful. And I think just the last point about how the immediate actions of the military was to shut down connection, to shut down communication, while lifting restrictions in the two ethnic states, in Rakhine and Chin, which is on record for having the longest network shutdown. Very, very ironic in that sense. But really resorting to a technique that many governments do use these days in order to cripple mobilization, in order to limit the kinds of information that go in or come out from these resistance movements. But people were very quick. I think, again, as Debbie said, many of these activists, journalists have been exposed to training and are very quick to share strategies on how to circumvent some of this, how to remain safe online, and to get as many people on board as possible. And I think that's really a positive sign. That level of awareness to keep that activism going on is really, really good, because this is the moment where you want to see whether these experiences, this knowledge can be used by those on the ground. So I'll stop there, but happy to answer any questions. Thanks, Bridget.
Thanks very much, Gayatri, for sharing the realities that the media were on the front line in dealing with the military for some time, and how the landscape is shifting and changing. We now turn to our last speaker, Romain Gallard, who is a associate fellow at ISIS in Singapore. He's also been based working in the business community collaboratively with different actors both in Southeast Asia and Japan, in Myanmar for many years, and has been following the country closely. I turn it to you, Romain.
Thank you, Bridget, and thank you for inviting me to talk today. I mean, I'll start with a bit of a personal history, my relationship with Myanmar, because I first lived in Myanmar in 2006. Back then I was an intern at the French embassy, and Yangon in 2006, that's the year after the capital shifted to Naypyidaw. It's a very dark time, a very dark city, run down. And then I returned in 2008, spent a year at the Yangon University of Foreign Languages. I just saw, by the way, some of my former Seyama taking part in the civil disobedience movement. But in 2008, it was after the Saffron Revolution and Nargis hit. And while those were difficult times, there were also a lot of changes on the ground. Civil society was active. There were a lot of activities. And then we moved towards the 2010 elections and the Tencent government. And then we know where it went from there. And I'm providing this background about myself, but most importantly about the country, because what I've been hearing over the last week from many individuals outside of Myanmar, especially investors, is that the coup that just happened is not that bad, and it could turn to a Tencent 2.0 type of situation, right? And in my view, this is a complete misunderstanding of what just happened and of the political risks that have started. I think the Myanmar economy is very big and complex. So of course, you know, you have I won't spend too much time talking about the agriculture sector. Maybe I will focus more on the interaction between the Myanmar economy and the rest of the world. And my concern right now is that there is an underestimation of the reputational impact of what is happening, and on the ability moving forward for companies, also INGOs, international financial institutions, to continue to operate in Myanmar like they have done over the last 5 to 10 years. I think there will be a lot of distrust in this new government if it holds. There will be a lot of distrust about its willingness to follow the law, despite what it says. I think there will be continued opposition to it, and this will lead to many organizations pulling away from the country, with significant impact on its people. For example, the tourism sector, which we know had grown until COVID hit, of course, but I don't foresee Myanmar being a very appealing destination in the near future, especially if the crackdown happens. Another example, right now you have a civil disobedience movement with many staff of foreign organizations and foreign companies taking part in those. If these people get arrested, I foresee a lot of backlash back home and some pressure on these companies to pull out. So I see a lot of companies hoping for this to calm down. Of course, the region is not what it was 10 years ago, and following events in Hong Kong or Thailand, there is, I would say, more tolerance towards these type of political risks. But I think Myanmar is a very different situation. There is a great misunderstanding of how volatile and unstable the situation is, and how sustained the opposition movement to the coup will be, and the impact that it will have on investors, but all organizations. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Romain, for those remarks. And I think you've raised important issues about reputation. And I think one of the things I would add to your remarks is that the military has been exposed in the international community like never before with what's happened with the Rohingya crisis. And it is important to recognize that the military were the ones who perpetrated the crimes. And it's the same general who was in charge of the military who's now taken over the country, Min Aung Hlaing. And I think this is an important difference because many people are aware of what the military has done, and that they have, and this is a big important change now, which adds to these reputational dimensions. We decided in terms of setting up the forum that we'd ask a few more questions among the panelists first and then open it up. So I have 3 questions that I'm going to ask the panelists, and after that we're going to stop the recording. But the first question I wanted to ask the panelists is to assess what the impact in particular are going to be on ethnic minorities, and also to raise issues associated that might be affecting the Rohingya community in particular, but not only exclusively so. I'd like to first turn that question to Thin, please.
Thanks, Bridget. I'll try to keep my answer quite short, and I guess the short answer is not good for the ethnic minorities or the Rohingya. Like Debbie has said, I think we have seen the junta trying to do this whole divide and rule strategy with bringing in some of the ethnic leaders on board, like the ANP in Rakhine, right? And I think we will likely see the army promising some sort of space for their political leaders of the ethnic groups, the space that they probably didn't have before with the NLD. But I mean, we've seen time and again, right, with the military after the ceasefires, with the Kachin and all that sort of stuff, is that they really don't care for the well-being of the ethnic people, and they actually see federalism, which is what the ethnic groups are looking for, as a threat to their existence, right, to their power. So they may promise a lot of things, but I really don't think they will actually look at giving the ethnic groups real autonomy or the kind of federalism that many are looking for. I guess for the Rohingya, I'm afraid, I agree with Debbie. I got really quite teary when I saw those tweets, apologizing to Yang Lee, and people say we really need to now look at this from a different perspective. But from the army's perspective, I think things will get even worse for them. There was talk about them being repatriated. They're going back to face the same people that drove them out, and in horribly vicious ways too. So, I mean, short answer, I think, yeah, it's not going to be good.
Very much, Thin. Debbie, would you like to add in anything?
Well, the soldiers, the battalions that went into Rakhine State and committed acts of genocide against the Rohingya, mass atrocities, they did that, some of that. They had a rehearsal in Kachin State and then moved to Rakhine State and did that to the Rohingya. And within a short time, they started doing the same thing to the Buddhist Rakhine, who had welcomed the army, who saw the army as saving them from the Rohingya, and then they themselves, the Rakhine civilians and Chin civilians, also subjected to the same atrocities. So Tin Lewin rightly points out that the guys who did this are now in charge, and that's very frightening. So the international attention, international pressure, international scrutiny, we're counting on that to force them into some restraint, and especially since all these young people are doing their best to circumvent all the blackouts in order to get images and footage out. But I think what I'm concerned about is there is going to be a fire sale of natural resources in Myanmar, because the military is going to be pushing very hard to regain what was lost economically during COVID. And that means ethnic communities who are the ones in the most commercially viable areas where their natural resources will now be targeted again, so that the military can clear those zones for economic exploitation. So we're not just talking about what's going to happen now. We're talking about what is likely to happen if the military stays in power in the next few years.
Thanks very much for that, and I think that you've rightly said that these are, these are communities that have been targeted of exploitation for many years, and they will continue to be on that in that particular area. I now turn to Gayatri. Would you like to say something on this?
Very quickly, I think when the genocide was happening in Rakhine State against the Rohingya, there was this whole also sort of debate between the coverage of the international media versus the local media. It's a very it's a touchy subject for many. It was a difficult subject, and I think many were caught in a situation where it was damned if you do, damned if you didn't, right? It was a difficult one. But I think one of the points that I would bring up, and it's very much in relation to this, is that the ongoing conflicts and the ongoing pressure in the other states as well. And as the other two speakers have said, that it did not cease, it did not stop during the point of this transition. And I think one of the comments at that time by some of those who were viewing the international reporting as being quite selective also was that you need to have a much more broader view, and also to look at it not singly, not in isolated cases, but to look at it as a broader issue. And I think that this is also the time that we need to look at it in that frame, because I think it doesn't help, I think, the cause also to pick and choose which battles to highlight, especially from the perspective of the media. So I think how it would impact ethnic minorities also depends on how the media, both inside and outside of the country, choose to speak about what's going on now. So I think that's an important reminder that also comes from people who are in the country who say, like, keep the eye on the issue, which is much broader than what happens to small groups or to one community, because it is a systemic issue.
And just to add on to what you said, Gayatri, just now, we talked earlier, Debbie spoke about the divide and rule tactics that the military is using, but one of their other tactics has been to use kind of religious nationalist tensions and to use hate speech. And it's not a coincidence that we've seen the military try to show pictures on the media of them with senior Buddhist monks. And I think that there is concern that they're going to use the same repertoire of promoting hate speech as towards ethnic minorities, and particularly the Rohingya, but not only them, in that context. And I think that this is something that they use where they're trying to take over the media narrative in a particular set of ways. I would also say, just as an add-on, is that we've also seen in today's protests, but also some yesterday, a lot of Buddhist monks also participating. And so I think that it is important to recognize that the composition is not of the Buddhist community from the perspective of leaders and monks, and the Sangha is actually quite divided and in many ways supportive of the general public who are protesting in the civil disobedience movement. Romain, you're last but not least on this issue. I turn to you.
Thank you. So first, first of all, a lot of migrant workers in Thailand, Malaysia, and beyond, they come from ethnic minority states or areas, and they have already been very badly hit by the COVID crisis, and then remittance is not going on, etc. So these regions are, in addition to human rights issues, have not been doing well economically. Second, I worry about the complete breakdown of trust between the ethnic groups and the military government. I mean, after what just happened, how can you, of course, before there were already issues of trust, but after they just did, basically taking away the political structure that they had put in place and that people had agreed to follow, I think it's going to be very difficult for ethnic parties or ethnic armies to believe promises that are made as part of the peace process. Which leads me to my last point, which is that you're going to see an attempt to buy out certain leaders in those areas. It is already being done with positions being given in the cabinet, and then there will be the chief minister positions, etc. And these type of attempts at buying out some leaders are going to lead to more divisions within those communities. Because as we know, the NLD actually fared pretty well in those ethnic minority areas. In certain areas, more than ethnic minority parties. It's not, again, I think it is beyond those two. It's really about the NLD as the party that was able to oppose military rule. So I think, yes, I'm quite pessimistic for these areas.
I don't know if I should say thank you for that, but I thank you for your sharing your wisdom. But of course, the pessimism is very deeply worrying. And of course, I think of something to be a serious concern. The other question that I wanted to ask, and many of your comments have already spoken to these things earlier, but you know, there's a lot of discussion in the international community about lessons, right? What could have been learned, all right, and what was done from what the experiences so far. And one of those, of course, you've already spoken about the need to see the country beyond Aung San Suu Kyi and beyond the NLD, and to see the situation in a more holistic way, and to recognize that this is very meaningful from a perspective of the experience of ordinary people who I use the words when I say shattered and heartbroken over this, because it's not just their quality of life, but their dreams for their future that they feel are very intertwined in what is happening. I think I'm curious for the speakers to address what do you think are one of the lessons looking back, and what does it sort of mean for the future? And I'm going to start with Gayatri.
So if I take a lens that focuses on media communication, because this is an area that, you know, I am very interested in, because we are in a region that has had many political turbulences, and we keep going through this almost like, you know, every 5-10 years. In terms of the media, and I think with the 2012 sort of declaration of media reform being a critical area of reform, I think one of the points that caused us a lot of worry at that time was that resources would move, particularly from international organizations, from civil society to state or state institutions. And that did happen, especially in the context of media, and also in terms of, you know, whether we looked at training or, you know, capacities for the media. So one of the points that many of the journalists on the ground who had, you know, been at the borders, who had worked with many of these organizations, also noted was that there was that shift quite significantly resource-wise. And today, if you think about it, then it is funds that have then legitimized a kind of a state. Now, we can't, of course, you know, by 2015, it was the NLD leaders, but it's very difficult to separate the kind of military influence also, because they were involved in some of the key agencies, ministries, and also in terms of decision making. So I think that is one thing to always keep in mind, that the support for civil society, independent media cannot be diminished, cannot be reduced as you think that, or as and when you think there is an opportunity for opening, and that, you know, you want to support the state, because I think that leads to this kind of, you know, legitimization of the problematic institutions. I think that's, for me, the most fundamental thing, because it was a voice that kept coming over the years, you know, media outlets being very worried, civil society organizations being worried that they could not carry the cause much longer because they were competing with the state. And this is a situation that actually has recurred in many other transitional societies as well, that the civil society then loses the ability to keep the state in check. I think what we see today, at least, is, you know, when I talked about, you know, being aware of some of the digital preparedness, that is something we see maybe by a select group on Twitter, on Facebook, but the general population may not have access to all of those things. And so discussions about reform, you know, business, media outlets, private outlets coming in, funding, need to keep in mind that when you come into a transitioning society, you cannot take a neutral position and think that by just operating without taking that human rights stand, that things will then fix itself. And that's one of the failures of thinking about how markets will fix itself, while knowing that politically, still a lot of groups are disenfranchised. So I think that's probably, for me, the main lesson learned, really.
Thank you very much, Gayatri. And Romain, what are your thoughts?
So yeah, looking back, I mean, first, I mean, I think it was very difficult to predict that it would go to such extent. Again, I mean, the path that was followed until last Monday was one that had been set by the military, and that the NLD and the international community had agreed to play by. And so I think that's my first point. My second point is, as much as I'm shocked and horrified by the blunt coup and reaction by the military, as if that was a solution to the many issues of the country, I'm also very worried by blunt reactions internationally, because I know, and I'm sure you know, getting good organizations, good businesses to leave the country because of sanctions or reputation issues, it's not going to help in many ways. So I really, I don't know how, and that's my next point. The thing is that the situation is so blunt that it's going to be extremely challenging to navigate, you know, between new sanctions and reputation issues and people back home. It's just going to be so difficult to continue business as usual, like many people think it's going to be once people go back home and the new government starts to rule. And so, and my last point will be on the government. I think, I mean, a big shift over the last 10 years was actually the ability to work with a government that before was a pariah, right? So you had the World Bank and other organizations that were not, or even the Global Fund, etc. They were working with the Ministry of Health to train doctors, etc. And I think I don't know how these organizations are going to respond, because at the end of the day, a country needs a functioning state, and we know how deficient the state and its institutions in Myanmar remain, and how much help it needs from the outside world. But if you have a state that is led by people who are illegitimate and who are sanctioned, who are tainted, how will it be possible for these institutions to continue to work with them and to fund them? And I see, again, it's going to become blunter and blunter as the opposition is sustained, and likely you have more violence and arrests. And this is really the extent of what is happening, that is about to happen, that worries me, and we are in this really dire situation.
Thank you, Romain. I'm going to turn to just two more speakers for the last question, so we open up for the conversation to everyone. But Thin, I want to, and Debbie, I'm asking this question to you, which is, what should the international community do now? What should be done?
Debbie, would you like to start, or should I go ahead?
Thin, when you go ahead first.
Okay, so I guess my I'll try and keep this short. Some of my answers will also perhaps relate to what, you know, the lessons learned as well. And I completely agree with what both Gayatri and Romain has said. But one thing that I would like to add, perhaps as a lesson learned, and also something for the international community to do, can we sort of come up with some sort of a handbook for how lawmakers to handle an illegitimate coup? Because there were MPs stuck in Naypyidaw, elected MPs, still representative of the people of Myanmar, and it took them 3 days before they took the oath and start having their meetings. This is the 1990 playbook, right? And it seems like we haven't learned anything from it. This was the same party that was in that same situation. You know, that we all know that the power sharing agreement with the military was delicate. We had hoped this wasn't going to come to it, but there was always a risk that they were going to do it. You know, why didn't, you know, I was talking to a couple of constitutional law scholars trying to push out this information that the coup was not legitimate. It didn't even, I mean, the army didn't even follow their own constitution in doing this. And they were saying, why didn't some of the ministers or the MPs just, you know, who were still, you know, not yet detained, go into an embassy and ask to speak to a cabinet member of a foreign country, trying to get it out there? Why did it take them three days to be detained and to start doing this? Can we, international community, can we please help with that? A handbook on how to deal with future coups. Hopefully it won't be needed for the future, but you never know. This is Myanmar after all. Another thing I think is, yes, I think it's really worrying with regards to sanctions. Again, I think we need to learn from 1990 when there were blanket sanctions and, you know, like, for example, the textile sector collapsed overnight. All these young women lost their jobs. I don't have the perfect answer. Arms embargo are definitely, I think, really important. But then we're talking about China, Russia, you know, India, who probably perhaps don't see the coup in the same way that we or some of the Western countries do. How do we convince them? How do we put pressure on them? But perhaps my last point, perhaps one thing that might be easy enough to do is for visa bans and visa revocations for families of the military who are abroad. We know the military likes to send their kids abroad to study. Their family likes to go shopping abroad. Take that away first. Make them live in the country that they are now trying to impoverish. Perhaps start with that.
Thanks very much, Debbie.
From the beginning, from day one, we'd already said, look, the 2008 Constitution is going to come and bite us all on the butt. It is a dangerous constitution. It's giving the military too much power. It protects them from prosecution. It's guaranteed, and what the military has done has not only perpetrated human rights violations with impunity and atrocity crimes with impunity, it's also continued with economic impunity. So the lesson learned here is that if we want to change the situation, and this is what we kept saying, it's not only about controlling or containing the military in terms of political power, but also in terms of economic power. The international, the global economy and the international systems in the global economy allow us and allow states and other government and other stakeholders to impose targeted economic sanctions on companies like the Union of Myanmar Economic Holdings, these military controlled and military dominated corporations in the country. It is very possible, and that's what we have to do in order to ensure that the military, and not just Min Aung Hlaing and his kids, but also all the military leaders that join the military for economic opportunities, understand that it's not in their interest to continue with this illegitimate regime. And I think, you know, in the past 15 years, ASEAN has delivered about 120 workshops in the field with grassroots activists on macroeconomics in the context of human rights and development, on business and human rights, and on transitional justice. And we really need to move forward in trying to ensure that economic policy and economic practices in the country are part of a transitional justice package. We've seen massive economic growth in Burma during the Thein Sein government and after, but we've not seen that wealth redistributed equitably. And that growth has benefited one group at the expense of ethnic minorities and people in the street. So we do need to really push on that. And we cannot have any tolerance for impunity. This is not just a question of reputational risk. Sean Turnell, an economist, is still in detention in Burma. And he's a conservative economist. He's not one of those very progressive people. He is a conservative economist, and yet he's in detention. What we need to see is that this is not a question of reputational risk for corporations working with the military. This is a question of understanding that under Min Aung Hlaing, we will see a move back towards military monopolies. We will see a move back to ensure that telephone subscribers buy only MPT and Mytel, the military phone companies' products, and move away from Urdu and Telenor and the other independent business players. So we need to understand that this is not a question of reputational risk. This is a question of the very real danger of return to military monopolies in the country.
Okay, thank you very much, Debbie, for raising these issues. And of course, raising Sean Turnell, who is a friend and somebody who is under detention, is an important issue. But we also don't know the exact numbers of how many Burmese people and ethnic communities are also under detention, and we're thinking of them as well. There have been some serious concerns about those numbers. Now we have half an hour. And we want to include the audience in the conversation. So we are encouraging, we're now turning off the recording so that people feel comfortable raising things that they want to openly. And we are now opening up for questions from the audience or comments. You can raise